I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this is Jim
Jim
and
and
Garrett at the
Garrett at the
movies.
movies.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our review of Joker. And of course, we are combining that with Taxi Driver as is necessary, as every sort of think piece on the internet did. We will be incorporating some of our discussions into Taxi Driver into our discussion of Joker because I think that there's definitely a lot of parallels going on here. We'll start with Joker. It's directed by Todd Phillips and stars Joaquin Phoenix and Robert De Niro, also the star of Taxi Driver, of course. And it is essentially an origin story for the famed character of the Joker. It is set before. No, we won't get into spoilers, but it's in the trailer that this is set before Batman becomes Batman. This is a Batman-less Batman universe movie, focusing only on the character travails of Arthur Fleck, this fledgling comedian who later, of course, becomes the Joker. So I'll
It's
turn
actually
it
just
over.
it's actually just Joker. There's no definite article. It's just Joker.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I was still going to turn it over to you, Garrett. What do you think of Joker?
This is a film in some ways that was a victim of its own hype success. There's sort of no way it could live up to the hype. On the one hand, there people were hyping it, saying that it's one of the most brilliant films of the year, and provocative and such. And on the other hand, people are saying it's an irresponsible film that's socially damaging, and it's neither of these things. It's a film that has some definite merits, some things that are definitely worth praising, but there's also, I think, some pretty considerable problems with it, but they're all problems that exist, I think, in the context of the film itself, not something that in any way spills over or is altered in any significant way by the broader social context of the times or in which the film is released. So I want to start with the things which I think are phenomenal. Now, everyone, I think, has agreed that Joaquin Phoenix's performance is fantastic, and that is absolutely true. Joaquin Phoenix is easily the best thing about this film. He is wonderful and fantastic, and in large part, in my opinion, because of what he does with his body. He's constantly moving in a way that communicates an incredible amount of emotion, an incredible amount of inner turmoil, and it sort of changes over the course of the film to sort of, in many ways, sort of follow his character arc. And so the what he does is almost like dancing in the film. Sometimes he literally is dancing in the film, and that is truly masterclass, and that makes it worth the price of admission in and of itself, even if everything else was terrible. But thankfully, not everything else is terrible. There's other things about it that are really good. Again, I think the cinematography, the color design, the sort of the sets, the costumes, the overall direction of the film, in short, I think is incredibly well done. I think that this film, when you watch the trailer for this film, it works really well in large part because there are so many scenes in this movie that you can take and look at, and the shots just look really good. Even taken out of the context of the broader narrative of the film, you can splice them together and get a real sense for the emotions being conveyed in the film. And same thing for the posters. A lot of posters for this film are just stills from the movie, which managed to convey a tremendous amount just in a single frame. So a lot is happening here in terms of the overall artistry that I like. All that having been said, I think and again, I realize this is what I say all the time, but the largest problems with this film come, from my opinion, from the script. I find that the script is, to put it mildly, pretentious. It's very full of itself. It thinks it's making commentaries. They're deep and insightful, when in fact I found them to be rather sort of shallow and obvious. I don't feel like I learned anything more about the character of Joker as he previously existed in the DC universe, although they did create a very interesting character to his own right within the film. It doesn't really tie in any interesting or significant way to the broader nature of the character. And in fact, every time we're reminded that this is taking place in the DC universe, I kind of felt like I was slapped out of my immersion. I think this film would have been a hell of a lot better if it was completely divorced from the DC universe entirely and stood on its own as a film that was not related to Joker as we know him. And there's this sort of really silly subplot involving Thomas Wayne, Bruce Wayne's father, and then another, absolutely preposterous subplot, which is supposed to be a surprise twist involving Joaquin Phoenix's neighbors, played by Zazie Betts.
Zazie Beetz.
Zazie Beetz, who was again, whose performance is quite fine, but whose character just doesn't make any sense. It seems like it was sort of shoehorned in there to try to add more layers and more texture, and more to do with the film. And it's almost something you can't spoil just because it's so obvious. You'll see it coming a mile away. And then it concludes, and again, this is not a spoiler because it's rather obviously being teased up in the trailer. It concludes with a dramatic scene, which again, as a piece of cinema, is dramatic and well done, but as a piece of writing, is just heavy-handed and obvious, and takes everything which is supposed to be conveyed through character action and through emotion and through the body language, which it did for most of the film, and makes it into a monologue that Arthur Fleck gives at the end, which just felt like, oh my God, get off your goddamn soapbox, movie. I get it. How about that society, huh? Ain't that society shit? Yeah, sure, it is. But I didn't need this movie to tell me that in such a ham-handed and obvious way. So I've gone on for some length, and I can see by the look on your face that you maybe agree with some things and disagree with others. So tell me where I'm wrong.
Okay, so you said a lot there.
Yes.
But let's take each kind of thing that you talk about, and I wanna discuss each element that you mentioned in depth. You said at the beginning that this was a film that was neither the greatest film of the year, nor was it an irresponsible film that has something to say about our current divisive times. I will agree with you that it's not the greatest film of the year, but I was significantly troubled by what I see as some of the messages of this movie. When I gave the review for this on local television, I said I've got 51 reasons to like this movie and 49 reasons to absolutely hate it. And that those people who are sensitive to the controversy that Joker has engendered, set forth. I think that those people who are sensitive to that controversy, this film is probably not for them. I couldn't help but read this film as a depiction of an incel. They turned Joker into an incel, essentially. You don't think so? Tell me why.
Because at no point in the film is his sexuality an issue. Arthur Fleck longs for recognition, for connection, for appreciation, to be seen, to be valued. But sex and romance actually has absolutely nothing to do with what he wants.
You mentioned the erstwhile Zazie Beetz subplot, and you said that was dumb, and that is where I am basing my incel thesis on, because that the only reason that Zazie Beetz is in that movie is for a scene after a scene of violence in which she is participating in that scene. Obviously, we're not spoiling, but you know what I'm talking about, and those of you who've seen the movie know what I'm talking about. That's the only reason that she's in this movie. And that brings up the incel argument, and that's where I'm basing my point of view on. I think that he is being portrayed as an incel, and that this is incels unite and incels strike at violence and blah blah blah. And yes, it's not held up as heroic. It's not held up as a it's not held up as a thing that we should aspire to. So some of the people who are making that argument in when they're advancing a thesis that this film is controversial, I think that's overblown, but I do think that it is sort of glorifying that character's journey to some degree. And this film simply lacks a moral center. That is what separates this film from Taxi Driver, and that is what separates this film from a more responsible telling of this story. Now, we look for that moral center in either the Zazie Beetz character, which we're not going to spoil how that drama ends. We look for that moral center in the character of Arthur's mother. Not going to spoil how that character ends. We look for that moral center in Thomas Wayne. He turns out to be sort of a vague imitation of Donald Trump in some ways. And yeah, that's the other thing. I was like, wait, Thomas Wayne is Donald Trump? Huh? He's certainly an asshole. And we look for that moral center in perhaps the police officers or other characters. And in no place does this film find a moral center. What is more, in contrast to Taxi Driver, one of the things. So I watched Joker, and then I was like, wait a second, I'm troubled by this movie. I'm troubled by what this movie's saying. I but it I recognize many of the parallels to Taxi Driver. Should I be troubled by Taxi Driver as well? And so then I went and watched Taxi Driver, and I wasn't as troubled by Taxi Driver because there are specific scenes in Taxi Driver where we see Travis Bickle sort of wrestling with his own mental stability. And I don't think you see the same type of things. I think in the movie where in the trailer, we see him dancing, and that takes place in a bathroom somewhere. And that moment feels like an apotheosis for that character. It feels like a becoming. And I don't think you see the same when Travis Bickle shaves his head into a mohawk. That's not a becoming to him. He is giving into urges that he has fought against throughout most of the first two acts of this movie, and that's not how it's portrayed in Joker. Joker, he is happy to become what he becomes, and that is troubling. That's there's an issue there.
I think to describe this movie as troubling is to pay it too large of a compliment. I disagree. I think there is a moral center. It just happens to be one that's shallow and obvious, and that moral center is the contrast between Arthur Fleck and the background society that he's sort of commenting on in his existence. And again, and this is a sense in which I think the connection to the DC universe actually is a good idea, and somewhat because we can import an understanding of the character. The Joker as a character is always someone who's trying to comment on the hypocrisy of society, about how we claim to have these values, but we behave in ways that is directly conflicted with it. The scene in the hospital in The Dark Knight, where he gives that little rant about how, if I kill a gangbanger, say a gangbanger's going to die, no one freaks out. But if I say that one little mayor's going to die, everyone loses their mind. The Joker is a character that uses violence to draw attention to the hypocrisies of society. And what this film is trying to do is to show how someone could learn to do that through experiences, through mental illness and so forth, and how a character could become such. So it's and as far as what exists in the film in and of itself, again, that is a moral center. I think it is what we see in the film isn't a particularly interesting moral center, precisely because the interesting thing isn't how he gets there; it's where he is. That's a really interesting morality that you see in The Dark Knight, but you don't really see that in the Joker. You're supposed to sort of connect the dots, but like so many other origin stories, like Hannibal Rising or the Star Wars prequels, when you see the backstory of this super evil character, it really is far less interesting in that respect, because part of what makes evil so compelling is that we don't understand it. And once we get a rational story that makes us go, oh yeah, I guess that kind of makes sense, it's far less compelling. So yeah, I think we are supposed to understand that Joaquin Phoenix's character is evil. Joker / Arthur Fleck is clearly the bad guy, but he's the bad guy because of the society in which he has been spawned. And so the real judgment, if you think Joker's evil, then the real judgment, it shouldn't be on him. It should be on the society that made him. And again, I think that's just cheap. It's easy. It's obvious. It's not terribly enlightening to anyone that's had at least an 8th grade education.
Sure. I like that reading of the film, but I think you're being too kind to the film in the same way that you think I'm being too kind to the film. I don't see this film as yes, it's got some scenes where it's commenting upon society writ large. There are a couple moments when especially with a therapist that he has at the beginning of the film, uh, whom he has at the beginning of the film. That is a moment when I think that it's very clear that they're making some sort of larger societal judgment, especially as it relates to mental health care. But I don't think that element of the film really gets developed all that much. I think this is a character piece, and because it's centered on the character, I I was sort of being led down the path to read it as a film about character journeys, and that's how I made these connections to incels, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and it's I think that element of it is troubling. Um, I'm trying to remember some of the other things that you said in your sort of initial go around that I wanted to comment on. I did comment on the Zazie Beetz bit, and I commented on how I found the film to be troubling from a political point of view. And it sucks because I think that our divisive times are mean that we are more inclined to read films politically than we ever were before. It's almost as though we are looking at the morality of films to go to say whether or not they're in our camps or not. And I don't like that form of film criticism, yet that is the type of film criticism that I feel that we're being pushed into by the sort of tribal nature of our discourses.
I share your reservation about being pushed into that, but at the same time, this is a film that's deliberately leaning in. I mean, you already mentioned the similarity between Thomas Wayne and Donald Trump. There is sort of a mock-up of the Occupy movements in there. There's a knockoff of the V for Vendetta masks, but in the form of clown masks instead. Another point about the plot, an idea that works great on paper is the Joker becomes a folk hero for the oppressed masses. And that's an idea I like in the abstract, but I think the film did not execute it terribly well. That happens largely in the background, and it's hard for me to really fully buy into the idea that it would play out like this. So,
Right. And especially like if we take that metaphor, like you and I, relatively left-leaning folks, would probably lean toward the Occupy movement between if we're gonna sort of cordon people off into the rich, represented by Thomas Wayne and Donald Trump, and the poor represented by the so-called Occupy movement. Well, then that casts us relatively left-leaning people as followers of the Joker. And I don't want to be one of the followers of the Joker, but I also don't want to be one of the followers of Thomas Wayne.
and
So
and
like
that's why the film's moral center is shallow and not terribly informative, because that's obviously not the choices that we have. There's much
mhm.
more moral nuance and complexity, and you can criticize Occupy, you can criticize Donald Trump, you can criticize society at large, while recognizing that it's not this sort of black white polar nature. And yeah, we don't have a Batman in this film to represent the good. And that's something in principle that I like. I think we should be able to explore darkness without necessarily having to have a moral contrast. So I think in the film's defense to my own criticism that's kind of shallow, sometimes we want films to explore that kind of darkness in a way where both sides are ugly and both sides are nasty, if not necessarily to the same degree.
I think the film that does that very well is Taxi Driver. I mean, it's a film that explores darkness. It explores a descent of a mind. The alternatives are not particularly attractive, especially when we're talking about the politician character. And then of course we have the sex worker who is sort of victimized by the Harvey Keitel character. All of these. So this is a film that sort of delves into that darkness and is still able, in my view, to keep its moorings. And even though there are racial elements to the film that I don't think have aged particularly well, and homophobic elements that I don't think have aged particularly well, I still think that it's a film that is able to delve into darkness and psychological degeneration in a much more nuanced and effective way. So I I think the film that this film wants to be is Taxi Driver, but it forgot one of the premier elements of Taxi Driver, and that is the Sybil Shepherd character sort of representing this possible out, and then Travis Bickle's own attempts to repress his. There's this great scene in Taxi Driver where Travis Bickle is talking to Peter Boyle's character, and he's like, I'm having these bad thoughts, and like De Niro's performance is so fucking good in this because you know what the bad thoughts are. He's filling that time, and he's filling that time by what we're getting to watch an actor and a character think, and it fills this long pause that he takes, and the camera stays on him for quite some time. So we get to see him thinking what he's thinking, and also his inability to express that in coherent sentences, aside from I've been having bad thoughts. And I think that's brilliant filmmaking that indicates that there is an internal conflict in this character. The internal conflict in Joker is, will I get famous? And I really and he's not even resisting his penchant and his predilection toward violence, whereas we see Travis Bickle doing that in the early acts of the movie.
So here I thought you were going to be defending the film from my criticism. I'm going to be defending the film from yours. So a couple things. One, I think there is a exactly parallel scene to the scene you mentioned in Taxi Driver in Joker, and it's in the trailer. It's when he's talking to his social worker, and he says, you ask if I have any negative thoughts. All I have are negative thoughts. And again, I think on the page that's not terribly interesting, but Joaquin Phoenix's performance will breathe so much life into that scene and into that delivery. And I think I'm not sure it's 100% parallel to the scene you're talking about, but it's certainly at least in the same ballpark. And here I'm going to drop it on you. I'm going to drop it on you. I feel a little bad about dropping this on you, but here it goes. Taxi Driver is much more about incels than Joker. Travis Bickle is much, much more of an incel character in frame and over the course of the whole film than Joaquin Phoenix is or Arthur Fleck is in Joker.
Yeah, I was gonna say something along those lines, but then again, like, is it right to put a social categorization that developed now into a 1976 movie? Like, is that fair to the movie? It's hard to make those criticisms, and it's why that it's difficult to be a film critic about these deliberately political films these days, because it's hard to sort of divorce one's personal politics away. And we had this conversation when we talked about Downton Abbey of all fucking things. So it's an interesting, it's interesting, and it's somewhat difficult to talk about these films without getting into this stuff. But yes, I agree with you that Travis Bickle, that if we made Taxi Driver today, especially if the director put in a scene where he, the director, plays a character that's talking about committing a hate crime, we would have, it would be a film that would launch 1,000 think pieces, and especially if it was Todd Phillips, who has been on the record having some controversial comments about so-called woke culture, and how woke culture is ruining comedy. Booksmart notwithstanding, maybe he didn't even see Booksmart. But yeah, so I understand that criticism. Let's go back to this moment that you're talking about. Do you see that moment as Arthur Fleck resisting his violent predilections, or do you see that moment as the screenwriter started tipping his cap to, this is where we're going with this character?
I think, and this is a notable difference between Arthur Fleck's character arc and Robert De Niro's character arc in Taxi Driver, and that's I don't think Arthur Fleck has violent predilections at the beginning of this film, whereas Travis Bickle, he's a veteran, right? He's already been in violence. He's come, you can see from the beginning that he's got sort of a violent streak to him. When you hear him commenting on the filth and the wretch on the seat, you feel the violence in his words. Whereas, in the early, at least in the first act of Joker, Arthur Fleck, he doesn't really have that sort of violent predilection in him. He is more pathetic than he is violent in the early parts, and the violence in him develops gradually. So no, I don't see that scene as him resisting his violent impulses, because I don't think he really has violent impulses. If anything, that they're self-destructive impulses and self-harming impulses, perhaps. In that sense, certainly is violent. But yet he's not thinking about hurting other people at that stage in the film. That hasn't crossed his mind. So in that respect, yeah, again, it's not perfectly parallel, but it is him fighting back his own demons. It's him wrestling with the thing in him that will eventually drive him to violence.
Interesting. Let's yeah, I think we've sort of covered the difficulties associated with this movie in good enough detail. Is there anything else there's one other thing I want to say about the performance, but is there anything else that you want to sort of add to the conversation about the controversy and whatnot?
Well, let me throw in a few more compliments really quickly. I forgot to mention that I think both the score and the soundtrack are also phenomenal. I think they create a tone and a feeling, again, in combination with the color scheme and the cinematography, that is very, very potent. Someone I heard once say, if you want to learn how to make films, you should watch movies with the sound off. You should mute them and just watch how the images are portrayed. And I think that this film, again, would look great with the sound off, but if you would miss that fantastic soundtrack and that fantastic score, which couples along with it. So I almost think that we should change that piece of advice to, you should watch the film with the dialogue muted and have it still have the sound going on in the background, the sound design, because again, from a purely directorial point of view, I think this is a phenomenal film. And if it had a better screenplay that it managed to avoid at least some of the problems we're talking about better, this would be an absolutely fantastic film. And credit where it's due. Todd Phillips, quad director, I think, has pulled off a hell of an accomplishment here, which I would not have imagined he had it in him after watching the Hangover movies. Didn't seem like the kind of guy who could do a movie like this, not in terms of theme necessarily, because there's similar cynicism and so forth that runs through both of them. But in terms of again, I think of the complexity and the artistry of the filmmaking, Todd Phillips has really done something fantastic here as a director. As a writer, not so much. Again, I think he's trying to play into this controversy. The film wants to be controversial, and I mean, it obviously is, in the sense that it got many people upset and writing these think pieces and debating it and so forth, as we're debating it here. So by that measure, I think it was a success. The desire to stir controversy was a success. But again, on its own merits, I think the controversy isn't in the film. It's entirely in the minds of the people who see it as controversial. The content of the film itself, even taken in light of contemporary issues like the Occupy movement, like incel culture, like sort of the lean towards the radical right in politics around the world and so forth. This film has nothing interesting to say about any of those things. It has nothing interesting to say about mental illness, even though there is some sensitivity to the character. It certainly could have been worse if it looked like they were blaming his mental illness for his violence or something like that. I think it handled that with a fair degree of nuance, and so I suppose it deserves credit for that. It could have played into that for controversy's sake, and I think for the most part, it managed to succeed at not doing that. Would have been a cheap blow. But that having been said, there still isn't any really enlightening, I think, about what it's saying about mental illness or poverty or social services that might somehow help solve crime through these sort of indirect methods. I think that was, I think, in large part the reason why Michael Moore loved the film, right? Because it seemed to make an argument for universal health care or something like that, going right back to your point into to seeing the films entirely through our left-right political lenses. And yeah, again, that's entirely something the viewer, Michael Moore in this case, is bringing to the film. The film does not have any of that in itself.
I would modify what you're saying. I think it's not saying anything interesting about our current political situation, but I don't think it's not saying anything about our current political. Just because it's not interesting doesn't mean that it's not commenting on it. So I think it is commenting on our current divisive culture. Sort of back and forth about the controversy again. That said, I think that I wanted to add one more thing about the performance, and that is Joaquin Phoenix's laugh. And especially when so there's an early scene, and this is somewhat of a spoiler, but it happens in the first act, so I'm not totally spoiling anything. He has an interaction with a child. The mother sort of shuts him down for it. He hands her a card. He starts laughing and hands her a card that says, when this person has a condition, and when he laughs, it's a result of an extreme emotional reaction, and it's not necessarily that something is funny. And I thought that was brilliant because it recontextualized every laugh throughout the entire movie. It made me realize that there were moments when this person was laughing and he was in utter pain. And I thought that that did a lot to connect me to this character and this character's journey. And I thought that was sort of a brilliant piece of, you're criticizing the writing. I think that's a brilliant creative choice on the part of the writers, and then of course on the part of Joaquin Phoenix to be able to carry that thing forward, so that he is laughing at times when we see utter pain in his eyes. And there's also a scene in a comedy club where he's laughing at all the wrong parts, and it's that it that's a heartbreaking moment. And when he finally gets a chance to do stand-up comedy, there's a heartbreaking moment there. And it's all because of that one element that they seeded at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah, no, a full agreement there. Yeah, that as a piece of writing was really good. It was an inspired idea, both as a device and then also as a way of, as you say, recontextualizing everything, every other laugh we hear in the film. And yeah, I mean, when you think about all the different ways in which people have laughed in films, I don't think I have ever heard this laugh before. It is so distinctive and immediately identifies this character in a way that sets him apart from any other human being you've ever seen in a film. And that is a fantastic performance. Again, back to can't say enough good things about what Joaquin Phoenix does on the screen here. Yeah, the laugh is wonderful, and the writing for that laugh, as you say, is fantastic too. So yeah, absolute credit where it's due. Would I be beating a dead horse if I had to turn around now and show another part of the writing, which I think fails?
Sure. I mean, the dead horse is dead, but let's beat it
Right.
anyway.
So again, this is not a spoiler if you've seen the trailer. There is a contrivance in the film that conspires to get Arthur Fleck, Joaquin Phoenix, onto Robert De Niro, Murray Franklin's talk show. There's a fantasy about him being on the talk show at the beginning, and then it sort of becomes a twisted, dark reality at the end. And again, as far as an arc from point A to point B, that makes perfect sense. That I understand why as writers you'd want that. But there's a mechanical problem there. How do you get him onto the show? And the way they manufacture that contrivance is just grossly implausible. I cannot believe for a second that it would play out the way that it does. It is cringeworthy. There's at least sort of 3 or 4 separate steps, and every single one of those steps that gets him there is like, oh, come the fuck on. That would never fucking happen. And again, I don't have there's no obviously better way in my mind off the top of my head to get him to that point at the end. But I have to believe that if you sat down and thought it through for a couple of weeks, you come up with something better as a way of getting him on the Murray Franklin show than they actually came up with in the film.
So what do you give this out of 5? I'm sort of curious about your rating.
Yeah, like I say, I'm deeply divided on the film.
Do you want to go 41, 51 like I did?
Everything
or
about
49, 51, yeah.
Almost everything about the film, other than the writing, I think is excellent. From a technical point of view, it is technically a wonderful film. But and again, as I say again and again, I'm very much a kind of writer first critic. Like Aristotle says, plot is the essence of tragedy. And if you fuck up the plot, then the tragedy isn't nearly so tragic anymore. And I think that they fuck up the plot and several points of the dialogue and so forth. So that for me, that hurts the film a lot more. Different people might think differently. People who care less about plot, maybe it's not going to bother them. But for me, that was a big drag on it. So it's hard to say precisely because I feel so conflicted about it. But if I have to settle, it's going to settle pretty clear down the middle at three stars out of 5.
That's where I am as well. I ended up just sort of skewing middle and saying 3. and letting it go at that.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, again, it's if you ask me to grade everything except for the writing, this would be a 4.5 star film. If you ask me to grade only the writing, it would be a 1.5 star film. So it somehow just has to average out to the middle.
I wouldn't go that low in the writing, but I see your point. Um, we've already talked a little bit about Taxi Driver, but I feel like Taxi Driver is such a iconic film that we need to spend a little bit more time on it. So Martin Scorsese, Paul Schrader, Martin Scorsese directed, Paul Schrader wrote it, Robert De Niro, Jodie Foster, Sybil Shepherd. Um, the story of Travis Bickle and his slow degeneration into violence and mental illness. What do you have to say about Taxi Driver that we haven't already talked about?
Yeah, I mean, what can you say about Taxi Driver that hasn't already been said, right? I mean, this film is a classic, and it is for classic for a reason. It is a fantastic piece of cinema. Again, in all the ways I was talking about for Joker 2. Again, Robert De Niro's acting is top, one of the best pieces of acting of 20th century cinema, easily. The character study is frightening but plausible. You get a picture of New York City in the 1970s, which is so gritty and so textured. It again. Having obviously I was not alive, much less in New York City when this film came out. But from everything I understand about the city at the time, this is a true to life portrait of what that city was like, and it really gives you a feel for a particular place and a particular time in the history of this country, which is very informative. Again, contrast with the Joker, which again, like I said, Joker, which I don't think said anything interesting about today's time. I think Taxi Driver said something very interesting about New York City in the 1970s. So yeah, I mean this film gets a lot of praise, deservedly so. I do have some criticisms and some problems about it, but before turning to that, I want to sort of pass it back to you and tell me your general thoughts.
Yeah, general thoughts, I pretty much agree with you right on. I think what's weird is this is made in 1976. Annie Hall comes out in 1977, and those are the same city. Like it's the same city, and yet what? Those are two completely different New Yorks. So it is a kind of
Lower East Side versus Upper East Side, right, man?
yes, yeah. Well, I think yeah. Anyway, so I like this. I love this movie. I like this movie. I think that there's so much good about it. Performances mainly, like it's mostly carried through by the performance by De Niro and by Jodie Foster and Sybil Shepherd. I think Sybil Shepherd is sort of the one normal character, which makes her sort of basically uninteresting, and yet she is able to sort of imbue that character with life beyond the simple, Mary Sue girl part. And there's that great moment when they're on their sort of date, where he talks about this perceived connection that he has with her, and you can see her sort of toying with it and going, I wouldn't be here if I didn't feel something similar as well. And it's weird, and you sort of like wonder, okay, what's this woman's backstory? What's going on? When in essentially she is kind of a plot device to sort of pull the rug out from under his mental stability, and for good reason. He takes her to a porno on a date. So I think that Sybil Shepherd doesn't get enough credit for how good she is in this movie as well. And she's got sort of a mysterious air to her in those early scenes that I think really carries this movie forward. But obviously, the main lauds go to De Niro, who is just amazing in this movie. It's weird how his ability to suck you into his character's mental state and almost make you think, "Oh God, yeah, let's wash this whole fucking city up." Like, and then I go, "Wait a second, Jim. You know, it's such a racially tinged argument that he's making, but he seems to be able to make it with such convincing uh, uh, passion that you're almost sucked into his ideology, until you sort of turn the movie off and go, wait a second, that's crazy. So he's fantastic. And Paul Schrader, he's never written anything better than Taxi Driver. It is weird how much this Taxi Driver does compare to his more recent film, Ethan Hawke. Remind me of the title.
First Redeemed.
First Redeemed, yeah. First Redeemed, First Reformed. Anyway.
First Reformed. Damn it.
Yeah, we'll find out. But anyway, I'll throw it to you and let you go on to your criticism. First Reformed. You are First Reformed.
Yeah, I said First Redeemed. Yeah, First Reformed. Yeah. Broadly agree with everything that you said. A little more nuancing. Yeah, Schrader's script is definitely very, very good, but at the same time, I think that it showcases Scorsese's incredible talent in large part because that same script with a less talented director, not even a bad director, just a less talented director, would be nowhere near as good of a film. A lot of the power of this film is carried over in the direction. The screenplay doesn't get in the way at all. It doesn't trip up the film. But at the same time, it's solid. It's more than competent. It is a damn good screenplay. But it's not I wouldn't call it a masterpiece of a screenplay in the way the film is the masterpiece of a film.
Well, he did never write the phrase, you talking to me.
Right,
that
yes,
was
indeed,
all De Niro.
yes.
Yeah,
De Niro's
that was in the script. That's Travis looks in the mirror, and De Niro turns that into one of the most iconic lines in the history of cinema.
Is it looks in the mirror or looks in the mirror and talks to himself?
No, I think it's just looks in the mirror.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so a large part of the credit has to go to the actors, and I think also to the directors. Scorsese elevates the source material in a way that truly masterful directors can do. Again, contrast the writing here with the writing for the Joker, and I think that you can see what a much better script looks like. A script that actually has something to say in the way that Joker doesn't really have anything to say. So all that having been said, again, all due praise to all the parties. I want to come back. We sort of already touched on it a little bit, but I think it is worth coming back to again, and that's my earlier comment that this film is much more about an incel than Joker is. You criticize that response as being kind of anachronistic, which is that's somewhat fair. It's in some ways unfair to criticize a film using a framework that wasn't really a social issue, as it were, or something in the social consciousness at the time the film was made versus today. But at the same time, in no small part because of the success of a film like Joker, which is deliberately and explicitly drawing from Taxi Driver in several different scenes and several different lines and gestures and so forth, to make it as obvious as possible. A lot of people are going to go back who haven't seen Taxi Driver, and they're going to watch it for the first time now, and they're going to not be able to help but see it through a modern lens. And I think you can simultaneously do two things here. You can watch a film through the lens of of the era in which it's made and evaluate it accordingly, and separately from that, watch a film from through a modern lens. And from a modern lens, this film does not hold up quite so well. Not because it's any less well made artistically, but because some of the themes and some of the ideas that it's exploring are kind of ugly and just not good. And I think the incel nature of Travis Bickle as a character, again, as a character who still, I think, inspires to this day many incel people identify with Travis Bickle, in part because they feel unappreciated, unloved, and they feel that they can't get Sybil Shepherd. I mean, again, you praise Sybil Shepherd's performance, and again, her performance is solid, but what Travis Bickle sees in her is just a pretty face.
Right.
He doesn't appreciate anything about her other than her looks and the fact that she's willing to pay attention to him. And that is very much an incel psychology, right? Women only matter because they're beautiful, and they're only valuable because I want them, not because they're valuable in and of their own self. And that's an ugly thing to put on film. And while I'm not saying the film is making apologies for that attitude, it's not exactly condemning it either. It's not,
see, that's where I disagree with you. I think that there's no problem with having incel characters in your movie. The problem is what the film's relationship to those characters and that kind of social framework is, and their way of looking at the world. I think Travis Bickle's way of looking at the world is unambiguously condemned in this movie. If any sense, in any sense, when he becomes like, if people read the ending of this film as unironic, then they're reading the film wrong. And that's not the film's fault. It's not the film's fault if somebody comes along and reads it wrong. It's clearly an ironic ending, just as the other sort of comp to Joker, King of Comedy. That's an ironic ending as well. And to not see it as ironic, I think would be an error on the critic's part, not an error on the movie's part. So I think that I think the relationship of the film to the character is different in Joker and Taxi Driver, and it is that I found troubling. That relationship between the film and the character that I found troubling about Joker, but not about Taxi Driver.
And that's interesting. And I can appreciate what you're saying in terms of the theory. I agree with you. Yeah, it's not having incels in your film; it's how the film relates to it. That's that on that theoretical point. I completely agree. But, and maybe this is me reading Taxi Driver too much through my knowledge of Martin Scorsese's other works, but my Scorsese studien, if you will, has sort of suggested that one of the hallmarks of Martin Scorsese is that while his films always have a moral context, what they lack is any sense of moral judgment. If you look at Goodfellas or The Wolf of Wall Street, for example, it's obvious that these characters are bad guys in the sense that traditional morality would condemn them, but the film isn't the one doing the condemning. The film is offering them up to you to condemn, and it gives you that freedom to condemn them. But I don't think the film itself is condemning them, and I think that's true for Travis Bickle too. I agree with you that the ending is ironic, but the irony there isn't moral irony, if you will. It isn't ha ha. The world thinks he's a good guy, but he's actually a bad guy. That's true, but that's not where the heart of the irony. The heart of the irony is, in spite of his worst intentions, he ends up being the folk hero. That's the irony.
Right. I mean, you mentioned Wolf of Wall Street, which is a movie I don't like. You mentioned Goodfellas, which I think you could talk about a difference in the moral judgment of the character and the moral irony of the character in Goodfellas. But of course, this isn't a review of Goodfellas; it's a review of Taxi Driver. But I basically what I'm saying is that I am ethically consistent in my like of Scorsese movies. Although I agree with you that that is what he does. He does it a little more successfully in Taxi Driver than he does in Wolf of Wall Street. I think he does it successfully in Goodfellas, but that's another sort of conversation for another day. Maybe we'll review a gangster movie and we'll talk about Goodfellas. But yeah, I and return to this question. I think that I think it is a form of moral irony at the end, where while it's probably not the form of moral irony that you're articulating, it is still a moral irony that he becomes a folk hero because of the bad things he does and because of what the poison in his head. Like, that's ironic. It's clear. I left Taxi Driver never thinking that Martin Scorsese was putting this incel character up to sort of glorify incel culture and reinforce incel worldviews. I left Joker questioning whether or not the film was doing it. That's sort of the end of the,
Yeah,
or that's my.
That is an interesting analysis for the two films and the perspective to have, even if I don't necessarily share them. So let me ask you about something else about Taxi Driver, because there's something I've heard you complain about in a lot of movies. And I don't know if you've ever complained about the technique as such, but I've heard you complain about the technique's use so many times. I got to wonder, you seem like someone who's not a fan of voiceover. But this is a film that relies very heavily on voiceover.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think Robert McKee says it best, and that is, if you can cut the voiceover and still make the point visually, then keep the voiceover. But if you're relying too much on the voiceover, then or if the voiceover is so reinforcing that it's just telling you if it's so on the nose that it's simply narrating what you're already fucking seeing, then the voiceover is unnecessary.
all my life I've been lonely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a little on the nose, ain't
I
it?
know. I know. I think that there are moments of the voiceover that you could definitely cut. I'm not always a fan of the voiceover in Taxi Driver. I'm not always a fan of the voiceover in Goodfellas, but would you really cut the line as far back as I can remember? I always wanted to be a gangster. No, of course you wouldn't cut that line. And then there are some moments here where I think the voiceover perfectly suits the images and sort of raises the images. So I would there are moments of the voiceover in Taxi Driver that I don't like, and you will see that reflected in my score. But yes, I think Ad Astra was the example of voiceover that is just so fucking obvious that it was unnecessary and that the images weren't doing the work by themselves.
Or the original cut of Blade Runner, which had that awful
Correct.
phoned in voiceover from Harrison Ford.
Which he clearly did not want to do.
Right.
But yeah. So what would you give Taxi Driver overall?
Overall, again, I soured on a little bit. You know, again, I think if in my first viewing of the film back when I was a teenager, I would have probably given it 4.5. But this time it's down to a little bit more. I give it 4 out of 5.
Okay, I'm at 4.5, and you hit on exactly the reason why it's down a half star, and that is the voiceover. So that's our show. This is a special Saturday edition of Jim and Garrett at the movies. Does that mean you won't get a Tuesday edition of Jim and Garrett at the movies? No, it doesn't. You will get a Tuesday edition as well. We will be covering Judy, but until then, I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this has been
Jim and
Jim and
Garrett
Garrett
at
at
the
the
movies.
movies.